Hey everybody, and welcome to Dominion Cards, the video series where we take a strategic, in-depth look at various cards in the board game Dominion. Today we're looking at Tide Pools. This is a 4-cost action and a duration card from 2nd edition Seaside, and it says +3 cards, +1 action. At the start of your next turn, discard 2 cards. So Tide Pools, despite being a duration card, it kind of just breaks important conventions about duration cards. This is not your normal duration card. Normally, duration cards tend to be better on future turns rather than the current turn. At the very least, that's because, in the next turn you don't have to draw it and you don't have to spend an action playing it. Tide Pools flips this on its head. It's completely different. You actually get a very, very good effect on this turn, but next turn, the card is usually actively harmful to you. It actually makes your turn worse rather than providing a benefit. So let's look at what you get from it this turn. So the effect that you get this turn, it's a non-terminal +3 cards. It's like, a Smithy and a Village pair in one. It's very, very good for a card that only costs 4. Right, a lot of the cards are going to give you +3 cards, they cost 5, or if they're non-terminal, like Laboratory, they're only going to give you 2 cards instead of 3. So it's a little bit like 2 Laboratories piled into 1 card, and it's cheaper on top as well. So, normal disadvantage of duration cards is that you want to have good effects earlier in the game rather than later, right? You don't have to want to wait for good bonuses. Dominion's a little bit snowbally, you want good effects now. This is not a problem for Tide Pools because it literally gives you the good effects right away. However, the usual disadvantage of duration cards is that you don't get to play them every turn, right? You normally have to wait at least 1 turn before you get to see them again, and this is also true of Tide Pools. It does stay in play for an extra turn because it's a duration card. So you can't use it as 2 labs every turn, unfortunately. Now, at the start of your next turn, you have to discard 2 cards. So this is usually very bad, right? This is sort of similar to being militiaed often, right? You have a 5-card hand, you get hit by militia, you discard down to 3. But it's actually, I'd say, worse than militia because this stacks. If you play 2 Tide Pools, then you have to discard 4 cards instead of 2. And of course, if discard attacks are available, like militia, then this stacks on top of those, and so those attacks become even harsher, right? You really don't want to be militiaed, when there's a Tide Pools in play, because it's just going to nuke your next turn. Now, as with all discarding effects, sometimes you have ways of mitigating the damage that discarding from your hand can cause, and Tide Pools benefits from the same things, right? It's still a discarder. So usual examples are going to be cards that like lower hand sizes, like Diplomat. Sometimes it's difficult with Diplomat to actually get started on a turn and get that village effect, but Tide Pools will do that for you. Draw to X cards, of course, like low hand sizes. You discard your worst cards and then you get to draw back up again. Sometimes you might even have Cursed Village, which is a non-terminal draw to X card, right? It's a village as well, and so that's perfectly fine for you to discard down to 1 card and then play it. You also have cards that just directly benefit from discarding, so Tunnel, Village Green, and some of the new ones in the 2nd edition of Hinterlands. Just examples of cards that actively want you to discard them and benefit from doing so. So this is all fairly standard stuff for cards that discard. Now, if you play multiple Tide Pools, or you're going to get discard attacked at the same time, you might have to discard all the way down to just 1 card in hand, or you might even just have to discard everything. If you're at 4 cards at least, and there's 2 more Tide Pools to resolve, you just have no cards left. Most of the time, so if this happens, you're just going to lose your next turn, right? It's a little bit like a reverse Tactician in that regard. With Tactician, you might choose to just get rid of your hand this turn so that you can get a much bigger benefit next turn. Of course, Tactician is terminal and gives you a lot more benefit than Tide Pools, just 3 cards. But, you can use Tide Pools a little bit like a reverse Tactician in that regard. There are also some cards out there that sort of like how you can discard down to no cards with Torturer. These cards can basically save you from a 0-card hand. And when you've got things like this available, Tide Pools becomes a lot easier to manage. It doesn't matter how many of them you stack on your turn. If you can recover your turn from 0 cards, you can play any number of Tide Pools. So the thing with tide pools is that you get to, because they're a start of turn effect, what you get to do is you get to discard all the way down to 0, and you can continue to just resolve your tide pools even if you have nothing left in hand, right? Like if you choose to resolve a tide pools and you have no cards in hand, you just don't discard anything, right? You're allowed to do that, and it just means you don't discard anything. Then some cards have their own start of turn effects that allow you to essentially recover from a 0 card hand. So we've got a couple of examples on this slide. The big one is Guide. This is a good protection against all forms of hand size attack. With Guide, you just, at the start of your turn, you may just discard any hand that you have left and then draw 5 cards. So with Guide, you just resolve all your tide pools, go down to no cards, then call Guide, and you're back up to 5 cards again. So nice and easy. I've put Wharf here, just an example of duration draw in general. Of course, some cards just draw you cards at the start of your next turn, so you can discard all the way down with tide pools and then draw up. Of course, if you don't have that many tide pools, you can choose to resolve the duration draw first, and then you have better targets to discard with tide pools. So you also need to be aware of that. But you can also choose to resolve them in the other order if you have enough tide pools in play. So it's very flexible to have like duration draw cards. If you're going to be using tide pools, right, you get to pick the best ordering that you want. Other examples here, I have Royal Galley and Summon. These cards allow you to effectively play a more typical draw card at the start of your turn. These are important because they allow you to actually play normal draw to X cards as well. Like if you have, say, Watchtower available and on the previous turn you summon a Watchtower, then at the start of your next turn you could just discard all of your cards with tide pools and then draw all the way back up, right? Back up to like 6 cards in Watchtower's case, by then like letting the Summon or the Royal Galley, like you choose to resolve their effects next. And then I have Blockade and Cargo Ship as examples of cards that let you gain something on the turn before, and it goes into your hand on the next turn. So with stuff like Blockade, you can just grab another tide pools, and then once you finish discarding your hand, you just put the tide pools from Blockade into your hand and draw back up again, at least a little bit. But, it can be other cards as well. You can have multiple Blockades or Cargo Ships and, like, put Village and Smithy pairs or whatever into your hand as needed, and, like, you get your turn back started again with those. These are not an exhaustive list. Of course, there's more. There's a load more, like duration draw cards, for example, but it's just to get you thinking about how you might be able to deal with having to discard your entire hand at the start of your turn. Because it happens right at the start of your turn, these sorts of effects, you can order them accordingly how you need to. Now, what we're talking about are ways to recover your hand. Sometimes there just aren't any. And you know what? It's fine sometimes to just play multiple tide pools and accept that quite simply on your next turn, you're just not going to have a turn at all, right? You're just going to discard down to uselessness. Even if it's just down to 1 card and like it doesn't matter what the card is, you're not really going to be doing anything. Now, why would you want to do this? Well, some kingdoms might have cards that really reward having a very big turn. So stuff like Bridge, which really wants you to play a load at once, or something like Fortune that just wants you to get like a lot of money because it's going to double the amount of money that you have. There's more examples, these are just 2. Alternatively, it might be critical towards the end of the game. You're doing a bunch of like end game dancing around like duchies and stuff, and really all you need to do is just spike up and grab the last province, but your decks are both like too full of victory cards to do anything. Tide pools can help you to just get those very occasional big turns, and in the situations where having one big turn is going to be a lot better than multiple smaller ones. So this is sort of the same sort of thing that like Single Tactician might do. It's a lot quicker and easier to get there with Single Tactician than tide pools. You don't need as many cards. The 1 card does a little bit more. But in the same way, that you play Single Tactician decks, tide pools is another sort of way to get that kind of effect. But with tide pools, the good turn happens first instead of second. So you get the good stuff a little bit earlier. Now, one thing people have considered when they looked at tide pools was like, okay, if I'm going to get rid of a turn, what if it was a bad turn? What if I had these particular cards or events that just give me extra turns with restrictions? So there's a couple of them out there, like Outpost from Seaside. You only draw 3 cards, and sometimes that's not really enough to do anything. Or there might be stuff like Voyage from Allies, which is a very restrictive extra turn, only lets you play 3 cards from your hand at most during that turn, and sometimes in decks there's not really much you can do with that. So people started thinking about, well, okay, what if with Tide Pools we just play like the Outpost of the Voyage, and then we just accept that this extra turn is going to get nuked? That sounds good, because what it allows us to do is then, have the Tide Pools come back for the main turn, right? We're not going to be discarding cards during the main turn where we have no restrictions. So in theory, you can do that with Tide Pools, right? Just have this extra turn where the whole point of the turn is to throw it away. Or something like Mission, where, you're not allowed to buy cards. There's a whole bunch of examples of things that give extra turns. There's one caveat with this. The problem is that Tide Pools in particular stays in play for an extra turn. And the problem is, if you're drawing lots of cards on your main turn by playing 5 Tide Pools or something, the problem is that if you drew your entire deck, when you go to take your extra turn, you're going to trigger a shuffle to draw the hand for your extra turn. And the problem is that your Tide Pools are still in play, so they actually miss the shuffle. And what that means is that once the extra turn is finished, and you then draw another 5 cards for your main turn, all of your Tide Pools are in the discard pile. That means they're not there to actually draw your deck with, and you have to slowly run through the rest of your deck until you shuffle, and then they come back. So in practice, even though this extra turn stuff sounds like it might be pretty cute, it's actually very hard to make use of it. I found it really, really difficult to make this a worthwhile thing to do. It's just because of the way Tide Pool stays in play. It's not like, say, Lich, where you directly just skip an extra turn. Lich isn't a duration card, so it doesn't miss the shuffle in the same way, basically, as Tide Pool does. Okay, well, never mind extra turns then. What about if we just simply don't have a next turn? Because Tide Pools, delays the bad effect until the next turn. There's actually no guarantee that you'll ever see it at all if this turn was the last one that you have, right? If the game ends, you're not going to get the start of your next turn effect. So what this means is that Tide Pools, basically every time it's on the kingdom, it has this possible use case where it can make your final turn of the game pretty good. For example of this, obviously anything that wants lots and lots of cards in your hand is going to benefit, but I've also found because Tide Pools is non-terminal draw, you can use that to draw up some important terminal payload like Bridge, and you've still got the actions spare that you didn't have to spend on terminal draw cards because you drew with Tide Pools instead. So, that can be good for really, really kicking off a big turn that otherwise probably wouldn't have been as possible. And sometimes, of course, it's easy because Tide Pools only costs 4 to actually get a lot of them at once. Maybe you just have a bunch of workshop style cards, and so before your last turn, you just pick up a load of Tide Pools if you can. You've got nothing better to pick up at that point, possibly as well. When you have that easy chance to pick up loads, the opportunity cost at that point is quite low, and it's really helping you with that final turn when it comes round. This is a pretty good use of Tide Pools, I found that when I tend to get it, it's probably looking more towards something like this in practice so far. It is also worth noting that if you have 2 Tide Pools and you alternate plays, so you just play 1 per turn, then the overall effect of this is that it's drawing you 3 cards and discarding you 2 each turn. And those are very similar to Forum, which is a little bit of a better warehouse. It's from the Empire's expansion. It's hand size neutral, right? If you start with your 5-card hand, you discard 2 cards, you're down to 3, and then you play a Tide Pools, you're back up to a 5-card hand, but you sort of pushed past, hopefully, 2 bad cards. It's worth noting that while we can make this comparison to Forum, it is much, much worse than Forum. So first of all, you have to discard immediately at the start of your turn before you potentially get the chance to draw a better selection of junk to push past. And of course, you also have to discard before you get to play the next Tide Pools. So, you have to discard first, then draw, which is the other way round. On Forum, you get to draw first and then discard. And of course, there's the fact that, 2 Tide Pools means 2 gains as well, instead of just 1 gain with something like Forum, which sometimes matters. Sometimes it's better, sometimes it's easier to get multiple cheap cards than it is to get like one more expensive card. It really depends. But it is worth noting that even though it's a lot worse than Forum, you can actually still use it this way, right? Like it's like if you're going to have the sort of deck that's usually somewhat filled with junk, like maybe there's a cursor around and you're not allowed to trash cursors in this game, you may find that just being able to push past them a little bit more actually has a lot of value, right? The thing is, if you do it this way, you're usually very hard to justify more than 2 tide pools in your deck, because you sort of really don't want to be like having to discard 2 sets of tide pools, right? Like if you're using it for sifting because of the limitation of it happening at the start of your turn and before you get to draw, like it's really, really hard basically to justify having 2 tide pools played on the same turn. So you're probably just only going to be limited to 2 tide pools max. In addition to that, because it happens at the start of your turn, usually before you get to draw anything else, unless you have like duration draw, there aren't really that many cards out there that are going to guarantee that you actually have junk in your starting hand. It's always possible that the tide pools you're forced to actually discard good cards. The one exception to this rule, I would say, is Haunted Woods. It's like the only sort of attack card out there that guarantees that the junk is in your hand between turns rather than being top decked for the start of next turn, which stuff like Rabble is going to do, right? So, of course, Haunted Woods also being duration draw means that there's a lot more room for having bad cards in your hand to then discard with tide pools. So I think it's a card that tide pools works fairly well with, just the unique parts of what Haunted Woods does. Like tide pools gets to deal with that effectively. You get to manage tide pools a little bit better, and it sort of helps mitigate the attack of Haunted Woods as well. So, sort of last thing really, tide pools cost 4, and so, it's non-terminal as well, and it's a draw card, so the question's always going to be asked, should I open with tide pools? So right at the beginning of the game, before you've bought any cards, typically you have every card is on average worth about 0.7 coins, right? You have 7 coppers in 10 cards. And so we can sometimes, right at the start of the game, consider that plus cards and plus coins are roughly equivalent. Cards not necessarily quite as consistent in getting you money, but, it's going to be providing you that cycling effect as well. Now, in the Smithy video, way back when, we talked about how Smithy can sometimes be used to try and spike high price points early. You're just going to be playing a Smithy, drawing a load of cards, hoping to buy that critical altar or artisan or inheritance or something, or a forge, like lots and lots of expensive cards that you might just want one really early if you can. Can we use tide pools to do the same thing? Well, it draws the same number of cards as Smithy, so technically yes. In practice, I've found that tide pools isn't really that good of an opener, and the reason for that is that, unlike, say, Smithy, I don't necessarily actually want a tide pools in my deck going forward. Like cards like Smithy, usually you find ways to use them. It's a decent general purpose draw card. But tide pools isn't really necessarily a general purpose draw card. Like, sure, it makes that one turn good, but it can make your next turn really bad. And also, being a duration card, it might get stuck in play. So you just play it less often. And in the end, you have this chance for a big turn, but there's a chance you might miss it as well, because you might just draw like 3 estates or whatever. Or you will have ended up having 3 estates in your hand, and then you've only got like 4 money, which really stinks. And also you've got this tide pools in your deck that is just giving you these really inconsistent turns throughout the game, which might not really be what you want. So I've personally found, I've tried it opening tide pools, and it hasn't been as good, but you can do it. By no means is it impossible to use tide pools in this way. So in summary, this has been quite a difficult card to actually assess. This video's taken a while, as some of you may have noticed. It doesn't really follow the normal conventions of duration cards. There's not really that much of a card like it. You want to think of it as similar to stuff like Tactician, but it's not really. Or you want to think of it as something similar to like Lich, but it really isn't. It's just for other cards that might hurt you in some way. Tide pools isn't really giving you that many resources as a result, for the trade-off of doing that. And at the moment, the community's a little bit all over the place in what they think about this card. Overall, I'd say the trend is that this is a pretty weak card, but I think people are starting to come round to it. Like, some people thought it was garbage, basically, when they first looked at it, but it's not a garbage card at all, right? Like, it has its use. And it sort of surprised me a little bit of how often you can actually use a Tide Pools towards the end of the game. Like, even if it's just on the last turn, like, it's really good in that case, honestly. But that doesn't make this a strong card. It's definitely on the weaker side. I mean, where is it on the weaker side? Possibly in the bottom 20%. In fact, it might even be worse than that. It might be like bottom 15, maybe even bottom 10%. Like, the opinions are all over the place. I can't really give you a good, accurate assessment of this yet, but this is sort of roughly around the sort of level that you're looking at. I don't think it's really going to find its way out of the bottom 20%, let's just put it that way. It can be hard to make use of Tide Pools throughout most of the game. I'd say Tide Pools is a card that tends to get better as you get closer and closer to the end of the game. Part of the reason why is that early on, you just don't really want to be hurting your hands. Usually you just want, good hands consistently to be able to buy lots of good cards and let Dominion snowball in the way that the game wants to. And Tide Pools doesn't necessarily help you to do that. But towards the end of the game, when all you're doing is like buying victory cards, like it's just a lot easier to manage having to discard at the start of the turn sometimes. You really want to look for ways to deal with low hand sizes or discard synergies. There are cards out there where you can turn the next turn effect into something good, and Tide Pools gets a lot better in that case. And of course, Tide Pools is going to prefer kingdoms where having occasional big turns is better than consistently small ones. Sometimes in the game, it shifts into that when it wasn't before. Like I say, some sort of like protracted end game where people are just like dancing around duchies, when really what you want to do is just go in and grab a province. Like that's another sort of place where Tide Pools can sort of come into its own as well. And that's really all I have to say on Tide Pools. So quite a lot, I guess, and well, still a little bit vague, unfortunately. I did the best I could, but I don't really have the experience with Tide Pools like I do for a bunch of the other Seaside cards where I've got like over a decade of experience, right? This is still a fairly new card. Right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to do random kingdom analysis, forcing Tide Pools in, and we're just going to see what sort of impact I think it might have in these kingdoms. So let's take a look. So no special setup here. And we have trading post and look out for trashing. I guess technically there's mine as well, sort of. But you have a way to gain like loads of gold, so like treasure maps. If you want to do a treasure-based thing, it's easy enough like to do that. There is no village, I note. There is wharf as a terminal. What are the terminals what you want? There's moat, there is 2 attacks, there's cut person, there's minion. So there aren't like discard attacks. There's also a moat, which isn't really that good without a village. So I guess the question is, are you doing like a lookout minion thing? So let's say we do the minion deck. Is Tide Pools good for that deck? Sort of. You can get away with 1. As long as if you have enough minions, it's highly likely you'll have another minion in your hand, and then you can just discard the really bad hand that you get. But bear in mind, if minion is played, you are going down to only having 2 cards in hand, right? If you have to discard a Tide Pools. You can't really get away with more, or you just end up nuking your hand, unfortunately. So, you could have in a minion deck, like, at most, like, 2 Tide Pools. Is that good? What else are you doing with the minion deck? Nothing, really. It's literally just playing minions and nothing else. That doesn't really sound very good. I guess the discard attack is still nice, but that sounds awful. What are other alternatives? Well, there's gardens, so maybe it's just wharf money with gardens support as well. And even if you're getting minion attacked, does it really matter? Probably not. To be honest, I might just do that. Wharf big money, but because Wharf is giving you buys, you get to get a bunch of coppers as well, and you can shift into just getting protection with gardens. I can see Tide Pools having some value in a Wharf big money deck. Like, honestly, it's fine. You're going to have weak cards, you're going to have some estates, some gardens, some coppers. Like, you're fine to discard those. It just gives you slightly better turns now and then. So yeah, it's probably just Wharf money with some Tide Pools probably later on. If the opportunity arises, like maybe you've bought a province and you've got 4 left over, like sure, or grab a tide pools. Maybe you just aren't that worried about gardens yet and you're gunning for provinces earlier. The gardens is there to really help. I think that's what I'm doing. I can't really see any value in building. There's nothing to build with here. Yeah, I guess that's it. So maybe I do tide pools. This is really not an interesting kingdom at all. Let's move on, shall we? Yeah, I wouldn't really buy tide pools early there, I don't think. I would rather have, silvers, I guess. What have we got here? No special startup as well. Or setup, excuse me. So, do we have any villages this time? Yes, there is Diplomat. Diplomat is the only village. Well, we have tide pools to help with that. There is Militia and Torturer as discard attacks. So that's a little bit spooky for using tide pools. Hand size is already low if we're going to be using, Diplomat. Diplomat being the only village, there is Ironworks as well. You can get a bunch of diplomats of that, and it helps reduce your starting. If you have Ironworks in your starting hand, you go down to 4 cards in hand, then you can diplomat. I'm actually wondering if it's even worth bothering with Torture and Militia, given that there's Diplomat. You actually really want to be playing the Diplomats here. I don't know if you like Library with that. Probably not. The thing is, the Diplomat's reaction to having attack cards played is nice. On the other hand, there's Torturer to give them curses, but there's also Upgrade to trash. I kind of like the idea of Diplomat Upgrade. Upgrade, of course, also reducing your hand size to help you Diplomat. But what are you going to be doing with that long term? There's also Expand, right? There's these 7-cost cards, so you can just upgrade your way to provinces, right? You can have a deck that's just rammed full of upgrades and diplomats, and eventually you turn upgrades into golds, and then you turn the golds into bang or expand, and then you just expand or upgrade your way into provinces. You can do that, right? And you can cycle pretty fast, right? Ironworks to gain a bunch of diplomats, try and buy a load of upgrades. Maybe because you want the upgrades, you don't want the Ironworks straight away. Maybe you just start off with Militia and Silver and you want to get the upgrades, and then you can, eventually when your opponent gets diplomats, you can just upgrade away the Militia and stop playing it, maybe. Maybe that's the thing that we do. Tide pools, again, might be useful late here, especially if you've got an Ironworks that was picking up diplomats. I think it's fine to get tide pools later. You don't want that many. You're not actually playing draw to X here, even though the diplomat likes it. You still don't want your hand to be too bad. But at the same time, it can be nice with tide pools to actually match up the upgrades later on, or the expands with the stuff that you really want. So yeah, I really do think this might just be mass upgrade with a diplomat. And I can see that possibly you might get tide pools, but you really don't want it early. I don't think tide pools is good to try and help kick off your diplomat, because I think between Ironworks and upgrade, you can already start making your diplomats villages. I guess it's worth noting that if we're using diplomat as a village, we're only using it for draw, right? We don't really need the actions from it. And in that case, we might actually add a library to our deck or something, right? Maybe we're okay with doing that. Maybe, or a patrol. Actually, I might even like library, to be honest. I think it's okay at some point to try and build a bigger hand, because you just get so many actions that you otherwise aren't playing. Ironworks, non-terminal, upgrade, non-terminal, diplomat to village. What other actions are you really playing, right? Expands, maybe, would be nice. So yeah, you can get library or patrols as well, I think. Maybe diplomats late, just we run out of... tide pools late, we run out of diplomats, we've got an Ironworks. So maybe I use tide pools here, right, later on. It's fine for a nice final turn to just steal the last of the provinces, but that's what I think we're doing there. Right, so get board number 3. There's again no colonies, excuse me, so nothing special. What do we have here? So this is just another no village kingdom, annoyingly. We've got Masquerade. So is it Masquerade big money? There's Torturer, but you can only ever play 1, so it's not as good. There is upgrade for thinning, but there's also masquerade, which is a lot better. And, you have got a bank, so you can do upgrade tricks, but there's no engine, so you can't really do that consistently to upgrade stuff into provinces. Honestly, I do think this might literally just be a masquerade money. What else am I doing here? There is Duke, there is Island, so there are alternative ways to score points later on. Maybe that sort of thing is fine for a masquerade deck, but really I just want masquerade and I want some money. Whether or not Tide Pools works in that sort of deck, probably not, but again, sometimes you just have a chance to buy one late, but maybe something like Island is probably better in this case. Maybe you care more about the points than the big turn, but there's no plus buy that you're running, so you don't necessarily need a very big turn. I mean, because of masquerade, your deck is already pretty thin, right? I really just don't see how I'm going to be making much use of anything else here. So we're going to be getting Masquerade Silver to open, and then we basically just play mostly a money deck at that point, I think. Masquerade is too strong, and it just sort of overpowers everything that's here. There's no real engine, so I think that's all we do. A bit sad, really. Again, Tide Pool's potential use really late, but it's fine if you don't get one. So it's not that great for it, I don't think. So we have Potion, a special setup here, but nothing else. And we got Potion because there is Familiar, so there is a junking attack. This is another villageless kingdom, but there aren't as many terminals this time. So we've got Treasury, we've got Familiar, we've got Pawn as non-terminals, and there's two treasures, there's Tiara and Bank. Now, a Tiara and Bank is a very good combo if we have a lot of treasures. Can we make use of that? Well, it seems very hard to deal with curses in this board. The only trashing is Salvager and Mint, neither of which are good at getting rid of curses. So Familiar seems very powerful to me. I'm probably just going to open Potion Silver and kind of really hope that I don't whiff. Maybe you're better off opening Salvager Silver and waiting on the potion. Maybe not, though. Maybe you're just supposed to gamble it. Would we use Tide Pools here? Well, actually with Bank and Tiara, I think there's value in doing so, particularly much later on. I think it's absolutely fine. This seems like the sort of board where actually just being able to spike a good turn is nice, especially if you've got Salvager as your only terminal. Just being able to pair it up with provinces and mill through the provinces sounds quite good. So I think it's important to get those curses in, so I'm probably going to open Potion Silver, look to get a Salvager. Later on, I will possibly get a Tide Pools, but otherwise I just want good treasure cards. And I'm just going to accept that actually I'm not getting rid of a lot of coppers. But is that still worth it for Tiara and Bank? How good is Tiara if you're not playing it on a bank here? I guess it's fine, right? Maybe you're going to buy a gold or a silver and you can totally use that. The fact that it lets you top deck is nice. You might be able to top deck a Familiar at some point if there's any curses left. You can even top deck a Tide Pools or something, for later on. So I do like that. I don't know. I guess I'm not that thin, so maybe this whole Tiara Bank thing is actually worse than it looks. You've really got to connect them together, and the only way you're doing that is Tide Pools, right? But given that your deck is otherwise pretty rubbish because you're getting familiared and getting full of curses, I do think there's a lot of value here in having a good turn. And in that regard, Tide Pools will help me do that. So I actually think, Tide Pools is the only realistic draw that you're getting here, and there are reasons why you want to draw. And there's as much junk, so it's not even that bad for discarding, or you just lose a turn, it doesn't matter. So yeah, I think Tide Pools is actually kind of important on this board, and we basically don't have any other choice. There's reasons to have good turns. Yeah, it's hard to connect stuff up otherwise, and there's good reasons to connect things up. So I can see me getting it here. Not straight away, but after a certain point, I think I'll be grabbing some Tide Pools on this board. Right, come on, let's have a much better engine or something for the final game. So again, no special setup here. What do we have? Well, there's no village again. None of these are villages. That's quite funny. There is Chapel. It's always something to consider, even if it's not an engine board. Ooh, okay, I see what's going on here. So you've got Chapel and you've got a simple money board, but there's also Corsair. So what happens is you thin down with Chapel, you get Corsair, and then people can't do anything anymore. That's literally what happens. Now, there is Astrolabe to get around Corsair. There is technically, like, Sailor as well as an alternative money to Corsair, but, like, you're not drawing very well here is the issue. Corsair gives you an extra card next turn, but what I really want is I want a thin deck where I'm playing Corsair every turn. And with no village, that leaves me to not really do much else. But other players, like, just get stuck. If you're doing that, like, there is no effective counter strategy. You just have to find other ways to get money. To that regard, there is Astrolabe, there is Sailor. And you can totally do that. There's Vassal, but not really. But, there is Vassal. You're not playing Vassal, right? You're playing Corsair. So Corsair gives you 2 money. The Sailor on the previous turn gives you another 2. There might be a way to get up to 8. Maybe you just have to buy a bunch of Sailors. And maybe you would get an Astrolabe or 2 with that as well. But maybe just more Sailors. And I think that's what we're doing, right? Corsair, Sailor, Chapel. That sounds about right. Again, eventually we're going to have enough green that actually tide pools might be useful. It might really help us later on in the game when we just got a bunch of provinces sitting around. But, it's hard to get a deck here that's big. You certainly can't just build a deck full of coppers and, like, ignore Chapel and use that to get around Corsair. Like, it doesn't work. So you open... What do you open? Sailor Chapel, I guess. Or if it's a 5-2, it's Corsair Chapel, probably. Yeah, I think that's it. That's all you're doing. So this is a very, very difficult game. All you want is a thin deck with treasures, but you're not allowed silvers and golds, right? And it's really hard to otherwise get money. I think Sailor is the key. Being a non-terminal money card that's not silver or gold, you really need those. And you just want to do whatever you can to play a Corsair per turn. I guess tide pools, you really got to get it late if you're going to get it, but it's also unfortunate in that you play a Sailor, you play tide pools, you actually don't want to play tide pools now. It sort of doesn't work with Sailor's little playing duration cards early trick. You'd rather have Astrolabes there where you can play that earlier and, get the extra money next turn. But I guess that's what we're doing. So we had a lot of boards there that weren't really engine boards, and as a result, tide pools was actually okay. Tide pools doesn't really like engines very much. Because engines, you're likely to be thin. There's no junk to discard at the start of your turn. You have other ways of drawing your deck. Getting discard attacked is pretty bad, especially discard attacking yourself. So tide pools worked out all right here, but it's tricky. And in a lot of these cases, you'll see that tide pools really only felt like a card that I was going to get late anyway. It's just a hard card to assess. It's not really that strong, but man, you find uses for it, That's the interesting thing about it. Like, it doesn't feel good, but you sure do buy it sometimes anyway, despite that. Interesting card. Anyway, I hope this was useful for you. Maybe I'm talking complete nonsense on this card. I don't know. This is really, really difficult to assess, this card, I found. So, anyway, thank you for watching, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.